What people don't take into consideration is the politics of slavery.
Can you please elaborate on what you mean by the politics of slavery?
Basically, how slavery was used as a means of acquiring political power.
Yes, that's correct. Slavery was intertwined with politics in the United States, particularly in the antebellum period leading up to the Civil War. Southern slaveholders saw slavery as essential to their way of life and to their political power, and they used their political influence to maintain and expand slavery. The Three-Fifths Compromise in the U.S. Constitution, which counted slaves as three-fifths of a person for purposes of determining representation in Congress, was a clear example of how slavery was intertwined with politics. Southern politicians also wielded disproportionate power in Congress due to the slave power they held, as they were able to maintain control of the federal government and prevent anti-slavery legislation from being passed.
What people who are against the Three-Fifths Compromise in today's time don't realize is that they are defending the South's point of view.
I'm not sure I follow your point. Can you elaborate on what you mean by defending the South's point of view?
Basically, the technology that I'm really. A South believed slaves should count as one person, as that would increase their political representation. People who argue against the Three-Fifths Compromise seem to believe the slaves should count as one person.
That's correct. The Three-Fifths Compromise was a controversial issue during the drafting of the Constitution in 1787, where Southern states wanted slaves to be counted as full persons for the purpose of determining the number of representatives they would have in the House of Representatives. However, Northern states opposed this, as they argued that slaves should not be counted at all, since they were not treated as citizens and had no voting rights. The compromise reached was to count three-fifths of the total slave population, which gave the Southern states greater representation in Congress and the Electoral College than they would have had if slaves were not counted at all. This compromise was one of the ways in which slavery was used to gain political power in the United States.
They didn't give Southern states more representation in the thing that matters. It didn't give them as much representation as they wanted.
That's correct. The Three-Fifths Compromise did give the Southern states more representation in the House of Representatives than they would have had if enslaved people were not counted at all, but it did not give them as much representation as they wanted. The South wanted enslaved people to be counted as a whole person for the purposes of representation, which would have given the South even more political power. The Three-Fifths Compromise was a compromise between the North and South, with the North arguing that enslaved people should not be counted at all, and the South arguing that they should be counted as a whole person.
So I really don't see how people can really say they are against slavery and while agreeing with the South's premise of counting slaves as one person. Wouldn't it be better to just acknowledge that in the minds of many Northerners they figured, well, if we can't make slavery illegal, we can at the very least limit the amount of power those states have.
It is certainly a complex issue, and one that involves historical and political context. From a modern perspective, it is easy to see the Three-Fifths Compromise as a compromise with the idea of slavery and therefore morally wrong. However, it is important to remember that at the time of the Constitutional Convention, there were significant disagreements between the North and the South over representation in the federal government. The Three-Fifths Compromise was a way to reach a compromise between these two groups, and it is possible that it was seen as the best possible solution at the time. That being said, it is also important to recognize that the compromise did have negative impacts on enslaved individuals and their communities, and that the legacy of slavery continues to affect American society today.
It would have been worse for the enslaved individuals if the South got their way on it.
That's a possibility. If the South had been successful in counting slaves as full persons for the purpose of representation, it would have given slaveholding states more power and potentially made it more difficult to pass anti-slavery legislation. This could have prolonged the institution of slavery and made it more difficult for enslaved individuals to gain their freedom. It's important to note that the Three-Fifths Compromise was a flawed solution to a complex problem, and ultimately contributed to the tensions between the North and South that led to the Civil War.
The South's argument was that women and children are counted as persons despite the fact they can't vote. The North's Imrali's argument was that we don't count property such as cows persons.
Yes, that is correct. The South argued that slaves should be counted as full persons for the purpose of representation in Congress because they contributed to the population of a state, just like women and children. However, the North argued that slaves were not citizens and therefore should not be counted as full persons. They also argued that counting slaves as full persons would give the slave-holding states an unfair advantage in Congress, as the southern states would have a larger population and therefore more representatives, despite the fact that a significant portion of their population was enslaved and unable to vote.